Alright, in here we have the match between XPodric and Chavod. XPodric is playing white, Chavod is playing black, and we actually see a King's Gambit opening. You don't often see this because it leaves the king open to attack. However, it'll be up to black to make advantage of it. After all, white has two central pawns, though now black has allowed their pawn to fall, and white has also allowed their pawn to fall, if black so chose to take it. But they did not. They instead played knight f6, and now we're actually in a position where white could gain a considerable advantage. They play knight d2, putting up some defense of this pawn, but the knight does attack it. The better move is to play e5, moving the pawn out of the attack of the knight and also attacking the knight itself for some threat, however. And once again, instead of taking, we see knight c6 and then e5. The pawn has now made its advance. But now it almost feels like it was too late for white to play that move. They should have played it earlier or played a different move. Now black has begun a lot of development. They can move this knight out of the way, and it's unclear who will be winning this game. Of course, it is still early on, but typically speaking, after the opening, one side has a considerable advantage over the other if one player knows more opening theory than the other. The King's Gambit is not typically seen at higher level play because it is generally accepted to be an unsound opening, which means that with proper play it loses every game. However, once again, if black does not know how to defeat the opening, then it isn't so simple. And now we have black opening up their own king with the move f5. And interestingly enough, white now has the advantage in the game. You see c4 attacking the black knight. Now the only move for black to make that does not leave them in a bad position is knight takes f4, trading off this knight, because this knight is really not in a very good spot. And in fact, if the knight retreats to b6 after c5 and knight a4, it can be taken. So after c4, we see knight d to b4, and we see queen a4 attacking this knight, but the knight is actually defended by the knight on c6. So white's attack is not entirely working. They did get more development in the early game, thanks to the pawn sacrifice on f4. However, white's king is left generally unprotected. At the same time, though, black is lacking a little bit of development. They are not very close to castling, and it will be difficult for them to do so. This bishop is at least 2 moves away from developing. And now, this queen actually defends the b4 knight as well. And so this knight on c6 is free to hop out of the attack of the b5 pawn and take on d4. a3, attacking the knight, forcing it to move away. And there aren't too many safe squares. I believe the only safe square for it would be on d2. No, it actually is defended on c2 by the knight on d4. And that is the move that is played. Or no, excuse me. Knight d to c2 is played. So after king a2, this knight on c2 can take the rook on a1. However, if black did play that move, the knight on b4 would be taken by the pawn, and then the queen would be attacking the knight on a1, and it would not be able to escape. So it would actually be a trade of 2 knights for 1 rook. Instead, black plays queen c5. Once again, this leaves their knight open for the taking. Instead, though, white develops their rook to c1, pinning this knight to the queen. If the knight were to move, the rook could take the queen. And now we're getting into an interesting position. The knight does have 2 defenders, but once again, this pawn on a3 can be used to take the knight on b4, removing one of the defenders of the knight. So black is in a fairly tricky position. It does seem like one of the only moves for black would be to play knight d4, giving a check. Instead, they play knight a2, and now black is simply going to be down a piece if this knight is taken. Rook takes c2 is one of the only moves. The other is knight takes c2, but once again, that move is not ideal. And we have it played. Rook takes c2, the only winning move for white. The black queen now has to move, otherwise it will risk being captured. And we see queen b6. One of the few squares where it is actually safe. And we're now starting to see some of the fruits of the early game's labors. We have a strong center control for white, and a lot of piece development along the queen side. The only problem is that white is lacking king side development. f1, g1, and h1 are home to some of white's pieces, and they have not moved out yet. We see b4 being played, attacking the knight, and now this knight is going to be captured soon. We see bishop c5. Doesn't seem like the best move. After all, rook takes c5 is a possibility. I believe the better move would have been to simply take with the pawn. That way you would still be attacking the knight on a2 with the rook. However, the knight takes, or the rook takes, is still fine. We now see d6, and so we may very well see the same position where rook goes to c2, following the trade of some pawns. We see c takes on d6, and will we see the rook come back to c2, or will we see some kind of an attack developing? We see rook takes f5. And now, we're actually in a stage of the game where black could gain an advantage. Knight c3 check, forking the king and queen of white. Black misses the move though and plays g6, allowing white to move out of that fork. They do not. They play rook to f6. However, there is still some counterplay. Following the takes, what we would end up seeing is knight g to f3, just developing some pieces, and since the rook is safe and attacking this pawn, the position will be closer to even than it was before. Still though, black's real only move is to go for this fork. If they do not see it, they will be in a very bad position, assuming white moves out of the way of the danger. We see rook f8. White's best move is, of course, to simply trade the piece away, but instead they go for an even more interesting move, which is to attack black's queen. And now we see queen takes, and bishop takes on d6. Now, barring any disastrous news, white should be in a very solid winning position. They do move the rook out of the way of the bishop's attack. However, this fork has been on the board for a very long time. Once again, white is attacking the rook of black, attempting to gain some sort of an advantage. But after rook e5, bishop takes on e5 is played, and black is falling further and further behind. Bishop takes h3, knight takes h3. Now, this fork may no longer be played because the bishop on e5 is actually protecting this square. So black's one way back into the game has been lost to them. However, they do still have some pawns along the side of the board, so it's not entirely over yet. But it will not be easy. They are also down 3 minutes on the clock. h5, attempting to gain some sort of momentum on the king side of the board. If black can make a queen, it would do wonders in helping them come back in the game, but it still would not truly be enough. White would need to lose some more material or be put in a position to get checkmated first. You see queen d7, maybe trying to set up for a checkmate after having the rook and knight move over. How will black respond? The black king actually cannot move at the moment. You see rook b5, or rook b8 rather, attacking the pawn on b5, but the square is protected by the bishop. So now, black is left with 2 pawns and a knight. If they lose both pawns, winning will be out of the question. Black resigns and white is victorious.